Evelyn Harper didn't cry when they sold her future to a stranger. She didn't cry when they put her on the train with a single suitcase and told her to smile. She cried when she stepped onto that platform and realized no one was coming. The man who walked toward her wasn't a husband. He was something harder, something quieter. Something that looked at her bruised wrists and said nothing because he'd already seen enough of the world to know what silence meant. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Evelyn Harper had rehearsed her face the entire way from Chicago. She'd practiced it in the window glass of the train car, watching the planes give way to foothills, and then to something wilder, something that didn't care about her or her situation, or the letter folded in her coat pocket that had promised a respectable life in the mountain territory of Colorado. She'd practiced a look that said, capable and grateful, and not afraid, and she'd worn it like armor for 4 days across the country, through every whistle stop and conductor's nod and curious glance from strangers who saw a young woman traveling alone with a single bag and no explanation. She wore that face until the train stopped. And then she stepped onto the platform at Harrow Creek Station, and the face fell apart, because no one was there. The station was a rough-cut plank platform bolted to the side of a mountain slope, the summer heat pressing down through pine trees so thick the light came in sideways and green. And there were maybe 4 people visible, a station agent sorting freight, an old man sleeping against a post, a woman in a sun-bleached dress moving away fast, and nobody who looked even remotely like a man expecting a bride. Evelyn stood with her suitcase at her feet, and her hat crooked from the train wind, and her carefully rehearsed face in pieces around her boots, and she looked at the piece of paper in her hand, one more time, as if the address might have changed in transit. Harrow Creek, Colorado Territory, June, 1883. Ask for Garrett Hollis. She looked up. Garrett Hollis, she said to no one in particular, and her voice came out thinner than she'd intended. The station agent glanced at her over a crate, looked away. The old man didn't stir. The woman in the sun-bleached dress had already gone. Evelyn picked up her suitcase, set it down, picked it up again. She had $14.30 in her coat pocket, the last of what she'd managed to save before leaving, and a one-way ticket stub that was useless now, and the folded letter and nothing else. Chicago was 4 days behind her and a world away, and she had burned every bridge getting out of it because she'd had to. She had not had a choice. That was the thing people didn't understand. The thing she could never explain to anyone without watching their expression shift from sympathy to something more complicated. She had not gotten on that train because she wanted a stranger for a husband. She'd gotten on it because the alternative was remaining inside a city that had already decided what it was going to do with her, and not one single person there had been willing to stop it. She stood on that platform in the summer heat and did not cry. She had promised herself she was done crying. "You're Evelyn Harper." The voice came from behind her, and it was not a question. She spun around. The man standing at the edge of the platform was not Garrett Hollis. She knew that immediately, the same way you know. Certain things without being told. Some instinct older than language that reads a person before your mind has time to catch up. He was tall, genuinely tall. The kind of height that didn't announce itself, but was simply there, and he was broad across the shoulders in a way that came from work, rather than intent, and he was watching her with dark eyes that gave away exactly nothing. He wore a plain canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a leather vest gone soft at the edges, and a hat that had been through enough weather to have earned its shape. No badge, no gun visible, though she had the uneasy feeling that was a deliberate choice rather than an absence. He looked like the mountain itself had sent someone down to have a conversation. "Who are you?" Evelyn said. "Caleb Whitaker." He didn't move toward her. "I was asked to come get you." "By who?" "Garrett Hollis." Something cold settled into the back of Evelyn's throat. "Where is Mr. Hollis?" Caleb Whitaker looked at her for a moment in a way she couldn't read. "He's not coming," he said. "That's the short answer. I'd like the long one. Garrett Hollis died 11 days ago." He said it without softening it the way you say a true thing when you've decided that kindness means accuracy. Fever took him fast. He didn't have time to send word before it did. Evelyn heard the words. She processed them in the way she'd gotten very good at processing things she hadn't expected by going very still and very quiet and letting her mind sort through the implications before her body decided how to react. 11 days ago. She had been on a train for 4. She had been preparing to leave for 3 before that. Garrett Hollis had been dead before she ever bought the ticket. "I see," she said, and her voice was remarkably steady, and she hated it for being steady because steadiness in this moment felt less like strength and more like a kind of hollowing. "His ranch goes to a cousin back east," Caleb said. "Already handled legally speaking. Harrow Creek's got a lawyer Haddon if you need to confirm anything." He paused. "I'm sorry, Miss Harper. It's a hard way to get news." "Don't apologize," she said. "You didn't cause it." He looked at her again in that unreadable way. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." She picked up her suitcase. She had no idea what she was going to do next. She had $14.30 and a dead man's address and absolutely nowhere to go. And the train that had brought her here was already pulling back out of the station, the sound of it fading up through the pines, and she was not going to cry on this platform in front of this stranger. "Is there a hotel in town?" she asked. "Boarding house," Caleb said. "Mrs. Dunmore runs it. She's got 2 rooms." "Good. Can you point me toward it?" "I can walk you. Town's a 1/4 mile. I don't need—" She stopped herself. She was in a mountain territory she'd never seen before with a dead man's address and no plan, and the man who had met her was big enough to throw her off the platform if he chose, and was instead offering to walk her to a boarding house. Her grandmother had always said that pride was a luxury for people who could afford the consequences. "Thank you," she said. "That would be helpful." He picked up her suitcase before she'd finished the sentence. She almost objected. She let it go. They walked off the platform and down a dirt road that cut through the pines, and the summer air was thick and warm, and smelled like pine resin, and something faintly mineral, and the mountain rose above the tree line in both directions. And Evelyn kept her eyes forward and her chin up, and thought very deliberately about the next 10 minutes rather than the next 10 years. 10 minutes. She could survive 10 minutes. "How did you know my name?" she asked while they walked. "Hollis mentioned you," Caleb said. "Before he got bad. He was worried about you making the trip for nothing. He told you about me. He said he'd written to a woman in Chicago." A pause. "He said she was coming a long way." Evelyn processed that. "Did he say anything else?" Caleb was quiet for 2 full beats before he answered. "He said you were running from something." Her step didn't falter. Her expression didn't move. She was very proud of both of those things. "He was mistaken," she said. Caleb said nothing. They came out of the pines into what served as the main street of Harrow Creek, a short run of storefronts, a livery, a saloon with its doors open to the summer air, a general store, a small church at the far end that looked like it was losing its argument with gravity. A few people moved on the boardwalk. Most of them looked at Evelyn the moment she appeared. Not all of them looked friendly. A woman in front of the general store watched her with the specific kind of expression that Evelyn had gotten very familiar with in Chicago, the one that had decided something about her before she opened her mouth. "That the mail-order woman," the woman said loud enough to carry. She was speaking to someone beside her, but looking directly at Evelyn. "Hollis is dead 3 weeks and she's still coming, Lord." Evelyn kept walking. Caleb stopped. He turned toward the woman with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere pressing to be, and said very quietly, "Hollis died 11 days ago, Margaret, and she was on a train when it happened." The woman Margaret made a sound that was not quite an apology and turned away. Caleb fell back into step beside Evelyn without comment. She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "She's going to say worse things once you're not there." "Probably," he said. "But not right this minute." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. The boarding house was a two-story frame building at the near end of the street, with a porch that had seen better years and a hand-painted sign reading Dunmore in letters that had been repainted over themselves enough times to look almost dignified. Caleb set her suitcase on the porch steps and knocked without hesitating 3 solid knocks, the kind that expect an answer. The woman who opened the door was somewhere between 50 and 1,000 years old, with sharp eyes behind small spectacles, and flour on her apron, and no expression that indicated she was pleased to see either of them. "Mrs. Dunmore," Caleb said. "Miss Harper needs a room. She came up from Chicago. She was expected at Hollis's place." Mrs. Dunmore looked at Evelyn the way an appraiser looks at an unfamiliar piece of furniture. "I know who she is," she said. "Word travels." She opened the door wider. "Come in then. I've got the back room. Smaller, but it locks." She said it locks the way someone says you might need this, rather than this is a selling point, and Evelyn didn't know whether to be reassured or more concerned. She went in. Caleb did not follow. "I'll be in town tomorrow morning if you need anything," he said from the porch, holding his hat. "I won't need anything," Evelyn said. "But thank you." He put his hat back on, looked at her for one more of those long, unreadable moments, and turned and walked back down the porch steps without another word. Evelyn watched him go longer than she meant to. The room Mrs. Dunmore gave her was small, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the back alley, and a washstand and a hook on the wall, and the lock on the door was solid just as promised. Evelyn set her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. She had $14.30. She had no plan. She had folded very carefully into the lining of her suitcase, not in her coat pocket, where anyone might find it, a small leather-bound ledger that did not belong to her, that she had taken from a desk that did not belong to her in an office she had entered without permission 6 days before she left Chicago. She had not thought much about that ledger since boarding the train, because thinking about it was the kind of thing that made it hard to breathe, and she needed to breathe. She thought about it now. The ledger contained 3 years of financial records for Hiram Caldwell's mill operations on the south side of Chicago. She knew what those records showed, because she had been the one who kept them. She had been a ledger clerk at Caldwell's main office for 2 years, long enough to understand the numbers better than the men who created them, long enough to see what the numbers were covering up. Wage theft, on a scale that was nearly architectural in its precision. 432 workers, most of them women, most of them immigrant, most of them with no legal recourse and no English, and no one to complain to, systematically paid less than their contracts specified, the difference skimmed off and redirected through a series of accounts that were recorded in that ledger in Evelyn's own careful handwriting, because she hadn't known what she was recording until the 3rd month, and by then she'd known too much to pretend otherwise. She'd gone to the foreman first. He'd laughed at her. She'd gone to the mill manager. He'd told her to go back to her desk. She'd written a letter to the county clerk's office. She'd received no reply, and then she'd made the mistake of telling another clerk, a woman she'd thought was a friend, and that woman had told someone, and 3 days later, a man she didn't recognize had stopped her on the street outside the office and told her in a tone so reasonable it was more frightening than shouting that Mr. Caldwell was aware she'd been looking at records she wasn't authorized to review, and that he very much hoped she wasn't the kind of young woman who caused problems, because women who caused problems for men like Hiram Caldwell tended to find that their problems became much larger than they'd intended. She'd gone home that night and found the newspaper with the mail-order bride advertisements, and found Garrett Hollis, and written the letter before she'd slept. She'd taken the ledger 2 days later. She wasn't sure yet why she'd taken it. Some part of her had reasoned that it was the only proof that the records existed in the ledger and nowhere else, that if she left it, it would disappear, that having it meant something, even if she didn't yet know what. Some other part of her, the part she didn't examine too closely, had taken it because Hiram Caldwell wanted it, and she had decided somewhere below the level of conscious thought that she was not going to let him have everything. She unzipped the lining of her suitcase and touched the ledger's spine. Still there, still real. She zipped it back up. $14.30. No plan. One locked door between her and whatever Harrow Creek decided to do about her. She lay back on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She did not sleep. She came down to breakfast the next morning to find 3 women from town already seated at Mrs. Dunmore's table, which was apparently a regular social arrangement that Mrs. Dunmore had neglected to mention. They looked up when Evelyn appeared in the doorway, with her hair pinned and her second-best dress on, and the silence that followed was the specific kind that has already had a conversation about you before you arrived. "Miss Harper," Mrs. Dunmore said from the kitchen doorway. "Sit down. There's eggs." Evelyn sat. She said good morning to the table. 1 woman returned it, 2 did not. "You came up from Chicago," said one of the women who had not returned her greeting. She had the energetic confidence of someone used to setting terms. "You were meant for Garrett Hollis." "That's right," Evelyn said. "Shame about Garrett," the woman said in a way that did not sound particularly like she felt it was a shame. "He wasn't much, but he had a decent piece of land." She paused. "What are you planning to do now, then?" "I'm working on that," Evelyn said. "There's not much in Harrow Creek for a woman on her own," said the second non-greeter. "Unless you're looking to work the saloon." She said it with a smile. Evelyn smiled back. She had grown up in Chicago. She had worked 2 years in a mill office run by a man who smiled exactly like that. She was very good at returning smiles. "I appreciate the suggestion," she said. "I'll keep it in mind." The woman's smile went slightly flat. The one woman who had returned her good morning, older, quieter, watching everything, looked at Evelyn over her coffee cup with something that might have been the first edges of respect. After breakfast, Evelyn put on her hat and went to find the lawyer. Haddon's office was above the general store, reached by an exterior staircase that groaned with each step. The door was open. The man behind the desk was somewhere in his 60s with a neat beard and an ink-stained hand and reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead. "Miss Harper," he said before she introduced herself. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." "You know who I am," she said. "Caleb Whitaker stopped by this morning," Haddon said. "He told me you'd likely come. He wanted to make sure you had the correct information about Hollis's estate before anyone gave you incorrect information." Evelyn sat. "And the correct information is?" "The ranch and property go to a cousin, one Arthur Hollis, who has already been notified by post and is expected to arrive within the month to either assume ownership or sell. You have no claim to the property. I am sorry." He folded his hands. "You were not married to the man, and Colorado Territory's laws on breach of marriage contract are limited in the best of circumstances." "I didn't expect a claim," she said. "I'd like to know my options." "You can return to Chicago. The stage runs twice a week, connects to the rail at Dunbar. Cost is $3. "What else?" He looked at her steadily. "There are a few ranches that take on seasonal help. It's hard work. Cooking, cleaning some outside, depending on the operation. The Aldercott place out past the ridge usually looks for summer workers." "What else?" "Mrs. Dunmore sometimes takes in a boarder who helps with the house in exchange for reduced rate." He paused. "And Caleb Whitaker mentioned he needed someone to help catalog the supply logs at his trading post through the summer. He keeps a trading post up on the high road a day's ride north. Goes up twice a week." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "He mentioned that this morning," she said. "Already." "He did?" Haddon said without expression. She looked at the window. The street below was moving through its morning business. She could see the general store. She could see 2 women standing outside it, talking, glancing up at the staircase. "I see," she said. "It's legitimate work," Haddon said. "Whitaker's a fair man. He's been in this territory 12 years. He's got a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Haddon was quiet for a moment, choosing something. "The kind," he said carefully, "that means when Caleb Whitaker says he'll do something, it gets done. And when he says a person is under his protection, people in this territory take that seriously." Evelyn looked back at him. "He said that I'm under his protection." "He said," Haddon replied, that you arrived here through no fault of your own, and that he intended to make sure you weren't left without options. Those were his words. She thought about this for a long moment. "I'll take the position," she said. "The cataloging work. I'll let him know." Haddon made a note. "He'll be by the boarding house tomorrow morning." She stood, and Haddon stood with her, and she thanked him, and she walked back down the groaning stairs into the summer heat, and she stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the sun on her face, thinking about a man she'd met yesterday who had already spoken to a lawyer about her future. She was not sure whether that was reassuring or the most alarming thing that had happened since she arrived. Both, she decided. Probably both. Caleb came to the boarding house the next morning at 7, as promised, with 2 horses and a pack mule, and no particular expression. "Miss Harper," he said from the bottom of the porch steps. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. She had her suitcase. He looked at it, looked at her, and didn't say anything about the fact that she was apparently planning to bring her entire worldly possession to a trading post. He took the suitcase and tied it to the pack mule with the same unhurried efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. "It's a long ride," he said. "You ride, not recently," she said. "I grew up in the city." He looked at the horse he'd brought for her, a brown mare with a calm eye, and then back at Evelyn. "She's easy," he said. "She won't run on you." She approached the mare carefully. Let the mare smell her hand. The mare was in fact easy. She stood still while Evelyn mounted, which was not as graceful as she would have liked, and waited patiently while Evelyn found the stirrups. "Ready," Caleb said. "Ready," she said. They rode north out of Harrow Creek into the pines, and the town fell away behind them, and the mountain came in around them on both sides, and the summer air was warm and moving, and smelled like things growing, and Evelyn Harper kept her eyes on the trail ahead, and told herself quietly but firmly that she was going to be all right. She was not sure she believed it, but she told herself anyway. The high road north was not actually a road, in any sense, she recognized. It was a track mostly cut through forest and along ridge lines wide enough for 2 horses side by side if they were friendly about it. Caleb rode slightly ahead, not from any apparent need to lead, but simply the way a person moves through familiar country, and Evelyn watched the way he watched the trees. Without watching them, the easy attention of someone whose awareness of his surroundings was old enough to be unconscious. They rode for an hour without significant conversation. She had questions. She had been cataloging questions since she arrived, which was a habit she'd developed in the mill office. You didn't ask everything at once, because that told people what you didn't know, and there was power in what other people thought you didn't know. You waited. You listened. You asked the right questions when the right moment arrived. "You had a trading post before?" she asked, when the silence had been long enough to be comfortable rather than strained. 8 years, he said. Before that, a pause. Not hesitation exactly, more consideration. "Different work," he said. "What kind?" He looked at her sideways. She looked back. "Law work," he said. "Sheriff. Federal," he said. And then he looked back at the trail, which she recognized as a door, closing politely but firmly, and she did not push on it. Law, federal, mountain territory alone, 8 years at a trading post at the end of a high road. She filed it and moved on. "What does the cataloging involve?" she asked. "Inventory records. I take in trade goods from the ranches and homesteads up the high road, pelts, dried goods, occasionally livestock. I supply them back with staples from Dunbar. The records have gotten behind." He paused. "I'm not good with the paperwork." "I am," she said. "Hadn't mentioned you worked as a clerk." 2 years, she said. "Then you're qualified," he said. Not a compliment exactly, more like an observation which she found oddly more satisfying. They climbed through a long switchback and came out onto a ridge, and the whole of the Colorado Territory spread itself out below and around them, in a way that hit Evelyn somewhere behind the Sternum Mountains, stacked against mountains in blue and gray, and the dark green of the high pines, and the sky above it all so bright it almost hurt, and the summer heat sitting on top of everything like a presence. Chicago was warehouses and cobblestones, and the smell of the river and the sound of machines. It was not this. She had never been anywhere that was this. She pulled up without meaning to, and the mare stopped obediently. Caleb stopped beside her without comment. He gave her a moment. "It's something," she said finally, because she had to say something. "Yes," he said. "It is." They sat there for a moment, the two of them on the ridge, with the mountains around them, and the summer sky over them. And then he clicked his horse forward, and she followed, and the ridge fell away again into the trees.
Whoa.
The trading post was a low, solid building of hewn logs at the end of the high road, with a covered porch and a woodshed and a stable and a well, and behind it, a cabin separate smaller. Caleb tied the horses at the rail and unloaded the pack mule with the same unhurried economy of motion and set her suitcase on the porch. "Post is the main building," he said. "Supplies, trade goods, records. Cabin's mine. There's a room in the post storage room smaller, but it's got a window and a cot. You can use it while you're here if that suits." She looked at the post building, looked at the cabin. "That suits," she said. "Good." He picked up her suitcase and opened the post door. She followed him in. Inside was exactly what she'd expected. Shelves of supplies, bolts of cloth, bins of dried goods, coils of rope, the smell of wood and leather and coffee, and something faintly metallic. And behind the main counter, stacked in no particular order, 3 wooden crates of ledger books and loose papers. She looked at the crates. "That's the backlog," he said without apology. She walked to the nearest crate and picked up a ledger, flipped it open. The handwriting was readable but sporadic, the entries inconsistent, dates out of sequence, totals rarely confirmed. 8 years, she said. "Give or take," he said. She set the ledger back in the crate. She looked at the stacks of paper. "I'm going to need a better system," she said. "I expected that," he said. "And more ink." "There's ink in the supply cupboard," he said. She looked around the room, looked at the crates, looked at the window that threw a long bar of summer light across the cluttered counter. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the train platform at Harrow Creek, loosened very slightly, by precisely the amount that having a specific and manageable task in front of you can loosen things. "All right," she said. "I'll start this afternoon." Caleb looked at her. She'd gotten no better at reading his expression since yesterday, but she'd started to think that was less about him being unreadable and more about her being accustomed to men who showed their intentions too plainly and for the wrong reasons. "Thank you," he said. "You're paying me," she said. "I am," he said. "But thank you anyway." She turned back to the crates before he could see whatever her face was doing, and she heard him move to the door and out onto the porch, and she stood in the summer light of the trading post with the mountain around her, and the ledgers in front of her. And she thought about the other ledger, the one in the lining of her suitcase, and what it meant that she had brought it here this far into the mountains, this far from anyone who could use it or find it. And then she thought about the fact that a man she had met 2 days ago had already arranged a room and a position and a wage for her, and had spoken to the town lawyer on her behalf, and had noticed her bruised wrists on the train platform without saying a word about them. She thought about what Haddon had said. When he says a person is under his protection, people in this territory take that seriously. She opened the first ledger and picked up a pen. She had work to do. Outside on the porch, she heard Caleb Whitaker go still. And then she heard faint but distinct the sound of hoofbeats on the high road, coming up from the south, coming fast. She looked up from the ledger. The hoofbeats slowed, stopped. She heard a voice she didn't recognize, a man's voice, flat and professional, the kind of voice that does not waste effort on warmth. "Looking for a woman," the voice said. "Came west from Chicago, young, alone. She'd have arrived in Harrow Creek 2-3 days ago." A pause. Caleb's voice even and unhurried. "Lot of people come through Harrow Creek. This one's particular," the other voice said. "She took something that doesn't belong to her. Man I work for wants it back." Another pause longer. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that," Caleb said. "But I'll keep my eyes open." Evelyn sat very still at the counter. She did not breathe. She heard the other man, One man, she thought, just one. But that could change, make a non-committal sound. She heard the creak of a saddle. She heard hoofbeats again, moving north past the post up the high road, moving away. She breathed. The door opened. Caleb stepped inside. He looked at her across the room, and this time his expression was not unreadable. It was very specifically and deliberately neutral, the face of a man who has decided not to show what he's just understood. He looked at her for a long moment. "You should eat something," he said. "It's past noon." "Who was that?" she asked. "Man, I don't know," he said, passing through. He moved to the supply shelves and took down a tin. "I've got dried beans. Takes about an hour." "Caleb," she said. He stopped, looked at her. She held his gaze. She had spent 2 years learning to look men in the face who did not want to be looked at directly. "He's going to come back," she said. Caleb set the tin on the counter. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her on the train platform when he'd seen her wrists and said nothing. The same specific quality of attention. "Yes," he said. "He probably is." "Then you should know." She stopped, started again. "You should know what he's looking for." Caleb waited. He was very good at waiting. She reached under the counter where she'd set her suitcase. She opened it. She pulled back the lining and took out the ledger and set it on the counter between them. He looked at it, looked at her. "That's what they sent him for," she said. "What is it?" "Proof," she said, "of what Hiram Caldwell has been doing to 400 workers in Chicago for 3 years. She put her hand flat on the cover. "And I am the only person who can read it, because I wrote it. And I am the only one who understands what the numbers mean." Caleb looked at the ledger for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You brought that," he said, "all the way from Chicago." "Yes," she said. "On a train, through Harrow Creek, up a mountain road." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, "That took some nerve." She hadn't expected that. She'd expected questions or refusal or the specific kind of careful distance men put between themselves and trouble they hadn't invited. She had not expected that. "I didn't have many other options," she said. "That's not the same as not having nerve," he said. She looked at him. He picked up the tin of beans. "Hour for the beans," he said. "And then you're going to tell me everything." The beans took longer than an hour, because Evelyn talked for longer than an hour. She hadn't planned to. She'd spent 6 months being very careful about what she said, and to whom, and she'd gotten good at it. The measured answer, the partial truth, the strategic omission. She'd walked into Hiram Caldwell's mill office every morning for 2 years, with her face arranged, and her tongue managed, and her real thoughts running quiet underneath like water under ice. And she had survived on that discipline in a way that had become so habitual, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to say a true thing plainly. But Caleb Whitaker sat across from her at the rough table in the trading post, and put a cup of coffee in front of her, and waited. And there was something about the quality of that. Waiting, the specific absence of agenda in it. The way he did not lean forward, or prompt, or fill the silence with suggestions about what she might mean, that made the careful structure she'd built around the story start to come apart at the seams. So she told him. She told him about the ledger clerk position at Caldwell's South Side operation, which she'd taken because it paid better than the factory floor, and because she had a head for numbers that her father had recognized when she was 8 years old and sitting at his knee while he balanced the household accounts. She told him about the first 3 months when she'd thought the discrepancies were errors, honest bookkeeping mistakes, the kind that happened in large operations when no one was looking hard enough. She told him about the 4th month when she'd looked hard enough and what she'd found. 432 workers, she said. Most of them women. Most of them can't read English well enough to check their own pay stubs. The contracts said one rate. The records showed another. The difference went into accounts I didn't have access to, but I could see where the money came from, and I could see it was leaving, and the numbers told the rest. "How much?" Caleb said. "Over 3 years, something near $60,000. He was quiet for a moment. "And the ledger shows that." "The ledger shows it in my handwriting," she said, because I was the one keeping the records. I didn't know what I was recording until I knew. And then I knew and I couldn't unknow it, and I had to decide what to do with that. So you took it. I took it, she said, and I got on a train. Caleb looked at the ledger sitting between them on the table. He hadn't touched it. He'd let it sit there the whole time she talked as if it were a living thing that needed to be approached carefully. "The man outside," he said. "He's not law." "No," she said. "Caldwell has men he uses for problems. Private men. This one—" She stopped. "I saw him once before I left, outside my building. I didn't know then that he was watching me." "You know who he works for specifically? A man named Cullen Huxley," she said. "He runs private investigations for Caldwell. Retrieval mostly. He finds things Caldwell loses." Caleb said nothing. "He's not going to stop," she said. "One man on the road today, but that's just the front. When he reports back that he didn't find me in Harrow Creek, Caldwell will send more." "How long do you think you have?" "A week," she said. "Maybe less if the man outside is quicker than I expect." Caleb looked at the ledger again. Then he looked at her. "What were you planning to do with it?" She'd been waiting for that question. She'd been turning it over since Chicago, since the train, since the platform at Harrow Creek. She had a half-formed answer that felt in the light of this room, with this man looking at her directly, less like a plan and more like a wish. "There are federal authorities who handle labor violations," she said. "I knew that before I left. There's a circuit court that convenes at Dunbar every other month. If I could get the ledger in front of the right person." "The circuit judge," Caleb said. "Yes." "Judge Ames," Caleb said. "He convenes in Dunbar the last week of July." She looked at him. "You know him." "I know of him," Caleb said in a tone that meant something more than the words and didn't elaborate. "He's a fair man. If the evidence is solid, he'll hear it." "The evidence is solid," she said. "I kept those records. I know every entry." Caleb picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it back down. He looked at the table for a moment, and she watched something move through him. Not doubt, exactly more like calculation, the internal mathematics of a man accounting for variables. "All right," he said. "All right what?" "All right, you stay here," he said. "You do the cataloging work, that part is real, the records genuinely need doing. And we figure out how to get you to Dunbar for the last week of July." She stared at him. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "Mr. Whitaker, this is not your problem. These are dangerous men. If Caldwell's people find out you're involved—" "Miss Harper," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not hard exactly, but settled the way stone is settled, not from stubbornness, but from depth. "I'm going to be straight with you. I've been in this territory a long time, and I know what it looks like when someone's carrying something they shouldn't have to carry alone, and I know what it costs them to carry it." He paused. "You brought that ledger 4 days on a train because 432 people had no one else to do it for them. That's not a problem that deserves to be solved by sending you back to Chicago." She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 6 months being very careful. She had decided somewhere in the careful machinery of her survival that she would not trust anyone quickly, because quick trust was the thing that had undone her the colleague she'd confided in the foreman. She'd appealed to the letter she'd sent to the county clerk that had apparently landed directly in Caldwell's hands. She had decided that she was done with quick trust. She sat across the table from Caleb Whitaker and felt with a clarity that unnerved her that she trusted him. Not quickly, not carelessly, but completely and without a good reason she could name, which was either the wisest thing her instincts had ever done or the most dangerous. "The man on the road will talk in town," she said. "If he asks in Harrow Creek about a woman from Chicago, he won't find much," Caleb said. "Most people in Harrow Creek don't know your name or your situation beyond that you arrived for Hollis and Hollis was dead. That's not enough to build a search on." "The women at Mrs. Dunmore's breakfast table know my name," she said. "Margaret Pruitt," Caleb said without hesitation. "She talks, but she doesn't know anything specific, and she wouldn't know what to do with the information if she did." He paused. Mrs. Dunmore is a different matter. She's discreet. You know these people well, she said. 12 years, he said. You learn who knows how to keep their mouth shut. She looked at her hands. The bruises on her wrists had faded to yellow-green, now less visible, and she'd stopped thinking about them as much as she had in Chicago. They'd happened 6 days before she left a confrontation in the alley outside her building that she did not like to think about in detail when 2 of Huxley's men had made very clear that Hiram Caldwell's patience had limits and that she had reached them. She'd gotten away because a bread delivery cart had come around the corner at the right moment, and the men had released her rather than make a scene in the street. She'd had the ticket already. She'd left 2 days early. I should tell you something else, she said. Caleb waited. The man outside Huxley's man, he didn't come alone in the sense that he's the only one who knows where I am. There will be a report. That report will go back to Chicago within the week. What happens after that depends on what the report says. Then we need the report to say you weren't here, Caleb said. How? He was quiet for a moment. Leave that to me, he said. That is not a plan, she said. It's the beginning of one, he said. Give me a day. She wanted to push further. She wanted specifics because specifics were what she trusted the granular certainty of a number in a column that either matched or didn't. But she looked at Caleb Whitaker and thought about the way he'd spoken to Margaret Pruitt on the boardwalk without raising his voice, and the way he'd talked to the man on the road without hesitating, and the way Haddon had said when Caleb Whitaker says a person is under his protection, people take it seriously, and she let it go. One day, she said. One day, he confirmed. She reached for the ledger, and he reached at the same moment, and their hands were an inch apart over the cover, and they both stopped. I'll keep it, she said. In my room. That's fine, he said. He pulled his hand back. Best place for it. She took the ledger and went to the storage room that was her room now and put it back in the suitcase lining, and she sat on the edge of the cot for a moment and listened to Caleb move around the trading post. The sound of him ordinary and steady. And she thought about the distance between Chicago and here, and how much of it was measured in miles, and how much in something else entirely. She slept better than she had any right to. She woke before light, which was a habit she'd kept from the mill job, and she dressed in the dark and went out to the main room and started a fire in the wood stove and put water on, and by the time Caleb came in from the stable, where he'd apparently been since before she was up there, was coffee. He stopped when he saw it, looked at her. You didn't have to, he said. I was up, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She poured the coffee and sat across from him, and they drank in the early quiet, and she thought about the fact that she'd made coffee for a man she'd known for approximately 2 days in a trading post on a Colorado mountain, which was not a sentence she could have constructed as a possibility 1 month ago. Tell me about the cataloging system, she said. What did you have before? He looked mildly surprised. You want to start now? What else would I do? He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened to his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the near territory of one. Fair enough, he said, and got up and went to the crates. They worked through the morning, him pulling records, and her sorting them, establishing a system that would actually function date, supplier commodity quantity, in quantity out balance. The previous records were a genuine disaster, in a way that she found almost soothing, because a genuine disaster had a genuine fix, and a genuine fix was the kind of problem she was best at. This entry, she said, holding up a page, June of last year, 40 yards of wool trade cloth. Who supplied it? Aldercott Ranch up of the North Pass, he said. They keep sheep. And where did it go? Homesteads further up, 3 families, Birch Dunleavy, 1 other. He thought. Harker. None of that is in the record, she said. No, he agreed. I told you I was behind. You're not behind, she said. You have no system. That's what I said. No, you said behind. Behind implies a system that's fallen behind. You have no system. This is where we start. He looked at her with the not smile again. All right, he said. Where do we start? She told him. He listened without interrupting. which was a quality she appreciated more than she could reasonably explain. And when she asked him to pull records, he pulled them. And when she set up the new columns in a fresh ledger, he watched how she did it without asking unnecessary questions. They worked until midday, when he got up and made something from the supply shelves, dried meat, hard biscuit, something that was technically cheese, and brought it to the table without ceremony. She ate. She kept working. By mid-afternoon, she had the first full year organized, sorted, totaled, and cross-referenced, and the satisfaction of it sat in her chest like something physical. "First year's done," she said. He came to look. He stood over her shoulder, not crowding, but close enough that she was aware of the heat of him, the solid presence, and she noticed that she was not afraid of it, which was interesting, given that she had been afraid of most large presences for a while now. He looked at the columns. "That's right," he said. "That first total's right. I know that from memory." "You have a good memory for numbers," she said. "When I have to," he said. "The law work," she said. A pause. "Some of it," he said. She didn't push. She turned to the next crate. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He hadn't used her given name before. She noted that she didn't mind it. "The man from the road," he said. "His name is Driscoll. He's been through Harrow Creek before, 3 years back looking for a different person." He paused. "He found them." She held herself very still. "What happened to that person?" "They went back to where they came from," Caleb said. Quietly. Nobody asked too many questions. "And this time, Caleb said, "I sent word to Haddon this morning, and Haddon sent a rider to Dunbar." He let that sit for a moment. "To Judge Ames, letting him know there may be an application for early testimony coming from this direction." She stared at him. "You did that already this morning." "You said you had a week," he said. "I figured we shouldn't waste days." "We," she said. He looked at her steadily. "We," he confirmed. She looked at the ledger open on the table between them, and at the fresh columns of figures in her handwriting, and at the man standing across from her who had apparently spent his morning arranging her future without mentioning it while they drank coffee, and she felt something move through her that was not quite gratitude and not quite fear and not quite something else, but contained all three. "You should have told me before you did it," she said. "You're right," he said. "I should have. I'm sorry." She hadn't expected the apology either. The men in her experience did not apologize for decisions made about her without her input. They explained those decisions. They justified them. They patted her on the head metaphorically and moved on. They did not say "you're right" and mean it. "Don't do it again," she said. "I won't," he said. She went back to the records. He went back to whatever he did when he wasn't talking to her. The afternoon moved. The light through the window shifted. She was 3 months into the second year of records when she heard horses on the high road again, and her hands went still over the ledger page. Caleb was already at the door. 2 riders this time. She heard one of them she recognized Driscoll's flat professional voice, and one she didn't. They stopped in the yard. "Whitaker," Driscoll said. "My associate wants a word." "He can have it," Caleb said from the doorway. She put down the pen. She did not move from the table. She could hear every word clearly through the open window behind her, and she did not close it because closing it would be more conspicuous than leaving it open. The second voice was older, smoother. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand you run the main supply operation on this road." "That's right," Caleb said. "We're looking for a woman who may have passed through your area. Young traveled alone, came up from the railhead at Harrow Creek 3 or 4 days ago. She'd have had a single suitcase possibly carrying documents." "I get a lot of people coming up the high road," Caleb said. "Homesteaders, ranchers, seasonal workers." "This woman would be notable," the smooth voice said. "She's not from the territory." "What's the interest in her?" Caleb said. "She took property that didn't belong to her," the smooth voice said. "My employer simply wants it returned. No legal trouble for the woman if she cooperates." There was a pause. Evelyn was very aware of her own breathing. "I had a girl come through 2 days ago," Caleb said. Came up looking for work. Said she was from somewhere east, I didn't ask where. She didn't stay. Took a meal and moved on north." He paused. "Said she was heading up toward the Harker homestead. They take seasonal workers sometimes." Silence. "The Harker place," the smooth voice said. "Full day's ride north," Caleb said. "Up past the second ridge." She heard the horses shift, leather creaking. "Much obliged," the smooth voice said. "Safe riding," Caleb said. Hoofbeats moved north. She waited until they faded entirely before she let herself breathe out slowly. Caleb came back inside. He looked at her across the room. "You sent them north," she said. "The Harker homestead." "Harker is 3 days north and doesn't take well to unexpected visitors," Caleb said. "By the time they ride up there and back, we'll have moved." "Moved," she said. "Where?" "I have a cabin," he said, "further up the west slope. I use it in winter sometimes. It's not on any road and it's not on any record." He paused. "We leave tonight, after dark." "Both of us?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the smooth voice outside its practiced reasonableness. The particular tone of a man who had delivered bad news to many people with a smile on his face. She thought about the alley behind her building in Chicago, and her wrists, and the bread cart that had saved her. "All right," she said. "Tonight." "Pack what you need," he said. "Light. We'll take the horses." She went to the storage room and looked at her suitcase. She opened it. She looked at the ledger in the lining. She took it out and held it for a moment, and then she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She opened it. Ran her thumb along the columns she'd written. 432 names in the wage ledger that corresponded to this one. 432 people who had gone to work every day and come home with less than they'd earned and done it again the next day because they had no choice, and done it again and again. And not one person in a position to do anything had done a single thing about it. She closed the ledger. She packed her bag light as instructed and came back to the main room. Caleb was already ready. He traveled light too, she noticed, with the ease of a man accustomed to moving fast. "Before we go," she said, "I want to know something." He waited. "The law work," she said. "Federal. You walked away from it 8 years ago and came up here and ran a trading post, and you haven't said why." He was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I recognize a closed door." "It's not a closed door," he said. "It's just—" He stopped, started again. "The last case I worked, there were people I was supposed to protect, and I did everything right, everything by the law, by procedure, by what I was told. And they still got hurt." He looked at the door rather than at her. "When you do everything right and it still goes wrong, you stop trusting the system that told you right was enough." She said nothing. She let that land the way he'd let things land for her, without rushing to fill it. "So you came up here," she said finally. "So I came up here," he said. She picked up her bag. "Then it's a good thing," she said, "that the ledger isn't asking you to trust the system. It's asking you to trust me." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that she was starting to learn to read, not fluently, not yet, but she was learning the vocabulary of his expressions, the way you learn a language you weren't born to. "That's easier," he said quietly. She didn't answer that. She went to the door and he followed, and they led the horses out quietly into the summer dark, and the mountain closed around them. And somewhere behind them, on the high road, north, 2 men were riding toward a homestead that would tell them nothing, because the woman they were looking for had already moved. She was already somewhere else, and the man beside her rode without a sound through the dark trees, and she thought about what he'd said, everything by the law. Everything right, and it still went wrong. And she thought about 432 people who'd also done everything right, and had it still go wrong. And she thought with a clarity that felt almost dangerous that what she and Caleb Whitaker had in common was not what she'd expected. They both knew what it cost to believe in something the world hadn't honored. They rode for an hour in silence that was not uncomfortable, and then the trees thinned, and she could see stars above, the kind of stars that Chicago never had, too many of them arranged with an indifference to scale that made her feel very small and oddly very free. "How much further?" she asked. "Half hour," he said. "Caleb," she said. He looked over at her, and in the dark, she could just make out the shape of him. The hat, the broad shoulders, the way he sat the horse like he'd been born to it. "Thank you," she said. "For the lawyer, for the judge, for sending those men north. For—" She stopped. "For all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're not through it." "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you for now." Another silence. The horses moved through the dark. "You're welcome," he said, quietly, and with the specific weight of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. "For now." They reached the cabin as the moon came up. It was small and low and solid in the way the trading post was solid, and it had the smell of a place that had been weathered and kept. And Caleb lit a lantern inside and showed her the second room, and she set her bag down on the floor and took a breath. She was 4 days out of Chicago. She was on a mountain in Colorado with a retired federal marshal who had sent 2 hired trackers a full day north into nowhere, and she had a stolen ledger in her bag that could dismantle one of Chicago's largest industrial operations if it reached the right hands. And the right hands were a circuit court judge in Dunbar who convened the last week of July. That was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. She sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her hands and thought about 3 weeks and what 3 weeks meant. And she heard Caleb move around the outer room, the solid ordinary sounds of him, and she made a decision. She was going to be all right. Not because the situation was safe. It was not. Not because Caldwell's men had given up. They had not. Not because the road ahead was clear. It was not that either. But because she had the ledger, and she had the knowledge of what was in it, and she had 3 weeks, and she had a man in the next room who had said "we" and meant it. She lay back on the cot. Outside, an owl called once in the dark pines. Inside, Caleb extinguished the lantern, and the cabin went quiet. And in the morning, she thought they would make a plan. A real one, with specifics. She almost smiled at that. She was almost asleep when she heard it so faint she wasn't sure at first that it was real. Hoofbeats, far down the slope. Not moving north, moving toward them. She sat up. In the outer room she heard Caleb's boots hit the floor. He'd heard it too. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. That was new. 6 months ago she'd been the kind of woman who needed 2 cups of coffee and a full 10 minutes before her mind engaged in the morning. 6 months of being afraid had rewired something in her, and now her body knew danger before her brain had finished waking up, and she was standing in the dark of the cabin with her boots in her hand and her heart already running hard. Caleb's voice came through the door, low, controlled. "Stay inside." She put her boots on. She heard him cross the outer room, heard the door open, not thrown, eased on its hinges, barely a sound. The man moved like something that had learned to exist in spaces without disturbing them, and in any other circumstance, she might have found that quality unnerving. Right now, it was the most reassuring thing she had. She went to the window. The moon was up and bright enough that she could see the slope below the cabin clearly. 2 horses at the tree line. 2 riders sitting still, not approaching, not retreating, just stopped at the edge of the dark, which was somehow worse than if they'd been moving. A man who charges at you has committed to a direction. A man who waits has options. Caleb was on the porch. She couldn't see him from the window angle, but she heard him, the particular silence of a man who is present and ready and not afraid. "That's far enough," he said, carrying in the night air without effort. One of the riders moved forward a few paces. Stopped. Whitaker. It was Driscoll's voice. Flat and professional, just as it had been on the high road yesterday morning, except something in it had shifted a tighter quality, less patience. "We rode all the way up to Harker's place." "I know it's a long ride," Caleb said. "Nobody at Harker's had seen any woman from the east," Driscoll said. "Nobody on the North Road had either. Funny thing." "People don't always stop to introduce themselves," Caleb said. "No. Driscoll said. They don't. A pause. My associate has a different theory. The second rider, the smooth voice the older one spoke from where he sat. Mr. Whitaker, I want to be plain with you because I think you're a plain-speaking man. The woman we're looking for, her name is Evelyn Harper, left Chicago with property belonging to my employer. That property has significant value. My employer is willing to be generous with anyone who helps return it. Define generous, Caleb said. $200, the smooth voice said. Cash. No questions about how she came to be on your mountain. Evelyn pressed her back against the wall beside the window. $200. That was more than she'd earn in a year of any job available to a woman in Colorado Territory. She thought about what $200 meant to a man running a trading post on a high road, thought about what it cost to maintain horses and supplies and a building through a mountain winter. She thought about Caleb's voice, saying we and meaning it. She waited. I appreciate the offer, Caleb said, but I run a trading post, not an information service. A silence that stretched long enough to have weight. That's your answer, the smooth voice said, not a question. That's my answer, Caleb said. Driscoll's horse moved a small shift, not a charge, but a repositioning, the kind that changes an angle. Evelyn recognized it for what it was. She'd seen men do it in arguments in the mill yard, that subtle physical grammar of a man deciding whether a conversation is becoming something else. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Driscoll said. Go back down the mountain, Caleb said. Get some sleep. Come back in the morning if you want to buy supplies. That's what I'm here for. Another silence. Then the smooth voice quieter. We'll be back, Mr. Whitaker. I expect so, Caleb said. The horses turned, moved back down the slope into the trees. She tracked the sound of them until it was gone, until the mountain night was quiet again, and the owl was back in the pines, and everything was exactly as it had been before, except that it was absolutely not. Caleb came back inside. She was standing in the middle of the room when he opened the door, and she didn't pretend she'd stayed in the back room as instructed, and he didn't pretend to be surprised that she hadn't. $200, she said. Yes, he said. That's a lot of money. It is, he agreed. And you said no. He hung his hat on the hook by the door. I said no. She looked at him in the lamplight. She'd lit the small lamp when she heard the horses, some instinct against darkness, and she thought about the smooth voice's particular brand of reasonable threat, and she thought about Driscoll's repositioning horse, and she thought about how different this mountain was from Chicago, and how the same certain things were everywhere you went. They'll come back with more men, she said. Yes, he said. Caleb. She waited until he looked at her. I need to know what we're actually dealing with. Not the trading post version. Not the careful version. What do you know about Huxley's operation? He was quiet for a moment. He went to the table and sat down, and she sat across from him, and the lamp threw light between them. Cullen Huxley ran private retrieval work out of St. Louis for 12 years before he went private contract, Caleb said. He's worked for industrial money on the east side of the country since about '78. He's good at what he does, which is finding things and returning them quietly. He paused. He doesn't usually send 2 men on a mountain road at night. Meaning he's more motivated than usual, she said. Meaning the ledger is worth more than $200 to Caldwell, he said. Which means what's in it is more dangerous than you've told me. She looked at the table. Tell me the rest, he said. Not a demand, a request. She had told him the broad outline at the trading post, the wage theft, the accounts, the $60,000. She had not told him everything. There are names in the ledger, she said. Not just account numbers, names. Officials who received payments from Caldwell's accounts, payments that aren't in any public record. What kind of officials? City level, she said. A county inspector who signed off on the mill's safety reports without inspecting. A clerk in the labor office who suppressed 3 formal complaints from workers. And, she stopped. And, Caleb said, a federal contracts officer, she said. Caldwell's mills supply material to a federal procurement program. The contracts officer approved the supplier certification. He received payments the same quarter. The room was very quiet. Federal, Caleb said. Yes, she said. He sat back. She watched him process this, not with alarm exactly, more with the steady recalculation of a man who has changed his assessment of a situation and is updating everything else accordingly. That's why Huxley's on the mountain at midnight, he said. Yes, she said. That's why. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, the name. The federal officer. She told him. His expression didn't move. But something behind it did something she couldn't name, a recognition that was too specific to be general knowledge. You know that name, she said. He didn't answer immediately. She watched him make a decision, watched it happen on his face in real time, the internal weighing of something. I know that name, he said, because 3 years ago, I was still adjacent to federal work, consulting not active. There was a procurement irregularity flagged in the department, and it went quiet before it was investigated. He paused. I thought it went quiet because there was nothing there. It went quiet, she said, because Caldwell's money made it quiet. Caleb looked at her. The ledger shows that, she said. The payment dates match the month the complaint was filed, and the month it was withdrawn. He got up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her, looking at whatever was outside. Dark trees mountained the place where the two riders had stood an hour ago. Evelyn, he said. Yes, she said. He turned around. This isn't a labor case anymore. It never was only a labor case, she said. I knew that from the beginning. That's why I couldn't go to the county clerk. That's why I couldn't go to the Chicago police. That's why... She stopped. That's why I got on a train. He came back to the table, sat down, looked at her with an expression she could read. Now she'd been learning his face for 2 days, and she knew this one. It was the face of a man who had just discovered that the problem was larger than he'd agreed to, and was deciding whether to step back or step further in. She waited. She did not plead. She did not reach for the ledger to show him again. She sat still and let him come to it himself, because she had learned finally, and at significant cost, that you could not push people into the right decision. You could only give them the room to make it. Judge Ames, he said. Yes, she said. He's the right choice, Caleb said. If the procurement irregularity involves federal contracts, it moves out of circuit court jurisdiction into federal court. Ames can refer it upward. He paused. But he needs the original evidence, the ledger in your hands. I know, she said. And we have 3 weeks to get it to him in Dunbar, he said. We have 3 weeks, she agreed, and 2 men on the slope below us, who just declined $200 worth of incentive to leave. They didn't decline, Caleb said. I declined. They'll regroup. He was quiet for a moment. I need to send a letter, tonight. To who? A man I used to work with, he said. In the federal side. He's in Denver now. If I tell him what the ledger contains specifically, if I give him the officer's name and the payment dates, he can start making inquiries at the federal level before we ever reach Dunbar. She understood immediately. So that by the time we get to Ames, there's already a federal thread pulled. So that Caldwell's people can't make it go quiet again, he said. Not if it's already moving from 2 directions. She thought about this. It was a better plan than what she'd had. It was frankly a better plan than she could have constructed alone, and she recognized that not with the sting she might have expected, but with something closer to relief. She was very good at the ledger. She was very good at numbers and records, and knowing what a column of figures meant. She was not an expert in how federal law moved or who pulled which threads. Caleb was. Write the letter, she said. He got paper. He wrote it by lamplight, and she watched him write without reading over his shoulder, because she recognized the intimacy of a man committing something he'd kept private to paper, and she respected the boundary of it. His handwriting was plain and precise. She noticed that the way she noticed everything that confirmed or complicated the picture she was building. When he finished, he folded it and sealed it. There's a rider in Harrow Creek, he said. Bern Aldous. He rides post between Harrow Creek and Dunbar twice a week, and he's been riding it long enough that nobody stops him or asks him what he's carrying. He looked at the letter. I need to get this to him today. Today, she said. I need to go down the mountain, he said. She looked at him. The implications arranged themselves quickly. He goes down the mountain alone. She stays in the cabin. The two men on the slope saw 2 horses here last night, which means they know 2 people are in the cabin. If Caleb rides down, they will watch where he goes and what he does, and they will know she is up here alone. Alternatively, she said, I go with you. That's riskier, he said. Staying here alone is also risky, she said. At least on the road you're between me and them. He thought about that. She could see him running at the variables, the probabilities, the way a man who used to calculate these things for a living still does it automatically. We go together, he said. We ride down as soon as it's light enough. We go to Haddon first. I need his help with something. Then Aldous. What do you need from Haddon? Paperwork, he said. If Evelyn Harper is a woman who took something that doesn't belong to her, then Evelyn Harper needs to be someone else for the next 3 weeks. She stared at him. You want to change my name? Not permanently, he said. Just on paper. A signed statement from Haddon that a woman named... He paused. What was your mother's name? She blinked. Clara, she said. Clara May. Clara May Whitaker, he said. Working as household help at the Whitaker Trading Post summer season, signed by Haddon as a witness. A beat of silence. Whitaker, she said. He met her eyes. There was nothing in his expression except the practical calm of a man explaining a legal maneuver, but she was aware of the name in the air between them, with a specificity that had nothing to do with legal maneuvers. It's the simplest cover, he said. A woman with my name on a document has more protection in this territory than a woman traveling alone. I understand the logic, she said. It doesn't mean anything beyond the practical, he said. And then he paused and added more quietly, unless you object to it. She looked at him for a moment. I don't object to it, she said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The lamp burned between them. Outside the mountain was quiet. The owl was gone. Get some sleep, he said. 2 hours if you can manage it. She went back to the small room. She lay on the cot and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about Clara May Whitaker, who was nobody and had no stolen ledger and was simply a household worker on a summer contract on a high mountain road. She thought about how easy it was to become someone else on paper. She thought about the 432 names in Caldwell's wage ledger who couldn't become someone else, who had to keep going back to the same mill every day and handing their labor to a man who stole from them with a smile. She slept for exactly 2 hours. They rode down before the sun was fully up, the horses quiet on the soft trail, the pines close on both sides. She watched the tree line without making it obvious that she was watching, and Caleb rode beside her with that particular alert stillness she'd come to recognize the way he managed to be completely calm and completely ready at the same time. They were halfway down when the man stepped out of the trees. Not Driscoll, not the smooth voice. A third man, younger, heavier, with the particular blank expression of someone hired for presence rather than intelligence, standing in the middle of the trail with his hands loose at his sides. Evelyn's horse shied. She held her, steadied her, kept her voice out of it. Caleb stopped his horse. He looked at the man with an expression that was the opposite of surprised. Morning, he said. The man said nothing. He was looking at Evelyn. She's my wife's cousin, Caleb said easily, as if that were a complete sentence and also an explanation. Coming down for supplies. The man still said nothing. He had the look of someone waiting for a signal from someone who wasn't visible. You need something, Caleb said. His voice was still easy. His hands were still on the reins. The man looked at him. Driscoll wants to talk, he said. Driscoll knows where my trading post is, Caleb said. Tell him to come up. He wants to talk now, the man said. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the trees on the left side of the trail, then the trees on the right, with the calm, methodical attention of a man taking an inventory. Tell me something, Caleb said. How many of you are there on this mountain right now? The man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Because I'm counting horses, Caleb said, and the tracks on this trail from last night show 4 animals, not 2. So there's at least one more man I haven't seen yet. The man said nothing. I want you to do something for me, Caleb said. He reached inside his vest. The man's hand moved toward his hip, and Caleb moved his hand out slowly, holding a folded piece of paper. I want you to take this to whoever's in charge of this operation. Not Driscoll. The man he works for the smooth voice from last night. Give him this. The man didn't move. It's a legal document, Caleb said, signed by Arthur Haddon, who is the practicing attorney of record for Harrow Creek and 3 adjacent townships. He paused. It states that any harassment, detainment, or interference with employees of the Whitaker trading operation constitutes criminal trespass under territorial law and will be reported to the circuit sheriff at Dunbar. He held the paper out. Take it. The man took it. Now get off the trail, Caleb said. The man got off the trail. They rode past him, and Evelyn kept her eyes forward and her spine straight and did not look back, and she did not say a word until they were a full quarter mile further down, and the trail curved enough that anyone at that spot could no longer see them. You had that document already, she said. Haddon prepared it last week, Caleb said. When he sent the rider to Dunbar, he thought we might need it. Last week, she said. Before I even asked you for help. Before you asked, he said. She processed this. You were already planning for this situation before you knew exactly what situation it was. I knew enough, he said. A woman arrives alone with bruises on her wrists and a dead man's address and rides a 4-day train to get here. That's a situation that needs planning. She didn't have anything to say to that. She rode in silence for a moment and thought about the bruises she'd thought he hadn't noticed. She'd been so careful, kept her sleeves down, kept her hands moving. You saw them on the platform, she said. Yes, he said. You didn't say anything. It wasn't the right time, he said. And it wasn't my business unless you made it my business. She looked at the trail ahead. It was Huxley's men, she said. 2 days before I left, they found me outside my building. I know, he said. You know. I guessed, he corrected, given what you've told me since. He paused. I'm sorry that happened to you. Don't apologize, she said. You didn't cause it. He glanced at her sideways. She heard the echo of it. Those were the same words she'd said to him on the platform at Harrow Creek when he'd told her Hollis was dead. Don't apologize. You didn't cause it. A small thing. But he'd heard it. She knew he'd heard it because she saw it on his face. They reached Harrow Creek before mid-morning. Haddon signed the papers in his office above the general store, while Evelyn sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, and he did it without comment, and without any expression that indicated he found anything unusual about signing a document describing Clara May Whitaker. This is legally thin, he said, blotting the signature. If anyone examines it closely, it doesn't need to hold up in court, Caleb said. It needs to hold up on a mountain road for 3 weeks. Haddon looked at Evelyn. Are you all right, Miss Harper? Clara, she said. He allowed a small nod. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. Thank you for the document, and for the letter to Dunbar. Ames is a good man, Haddon said. If the evidence is what you say it is, he'll hear you. He paused. The federal aspect complicates things. I know, she said. It means Caldwell has resources beyond what a simple labor case would motivate, Haddon said. He can't let that ledger reach federal review. The procurement fraud alone could end his contracts, and if the contracts go, the mills lose their primary revenue, and if the mills lose revenue, everything downstream collapses. He looked at her steadily. You're not just carrying a ledger, Miss Harper. You're carrying the architecture of a man's empire. She held his gaze. I know what I'm carrying, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. I believe you do. They left Haddon's and went to find Aldous. The post rider was at the livery, as Caleb had expected, sorting bags with the unhurried expertise of a man who had been putting things in order his whole life. He was in his 50s, weathered, with a face that had the quality of old leather, something that had been shaped by exposure into exactly what it was meant to be. He looked at Caleb, and then at Evelyn, and then at the letter Caleb held out. "Dunbar," Caleb said. "Marcus Webb. He'll be at the Federal Land Office." Aldous took the letter, looked at it, put it in his inner coat pocket without a word. "When do you ride?" Caleb said. "Tomorrow morning," Aldous said. "Good." Caleb put his hand out. Aldous shook it. That was the entire transaction, no money exchanged, no terms, set no further discussion. The letter simply transferred hands and became someone else's certainty. Evelyn watched this and thought about what it meant to have 12 years of built trust in a place, the kind of trust that could move a letter through the mountains on a handshake. She'd had nothing like that in Chicago. She'd had 2 years in an office, and a colleague who'd betrayed her, and a city that had looked the other way. They were walking back through town when Margaret Pruitt came out of the general store directly into their path and stopped and looked at Evelyn with an expression that had sharpened since their encounter on the first day. "Miss Harper," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt," Evelyn said. "There were men asking about you this morning," Margaret said. "In the store, asking if anyone knew where you'd gone." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "What did you tell them?" Margaret looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at Evelyn, and something moved through the woman's face. Not kindness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The reluctant recognition of a person who has decided that she has been on the wrong side of a situation. "I told them I didn't know any woman named Harper," Margaret said. "I told them the only woman who came through here recently was a worker up at the Whitaker Post, name of Clara something." The silence lasted one full beat. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Margaret made the sound that wasn't quite anything. "Those men have bad manners," she said. "And bad manners in my town irritate me." She went back inside the store. Caleb said nothing. He looked at the door that had closed behind Margaret Pruitt, and then he looked at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and there was something between them in that look that neither of them named. "People surprise you," she said. "Sometimes," he said. They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon heat, and by the time they reached the cabin, the sun was angled west, and the shadows were long through the pines, and Evelyn was tired in a way that had layers to it. Not just the body's tiredness, but something deeper, the exhaustion of sustained vigilance, of spending every hour of every day monitoring herself and the space around her for threats. She sat on the porch step while Caleb took the horses around to the stable, and she let herself be tired for exactly 5 minutes, which was all she allowed. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Different from before. Not the mountain approach from the slope. These came from the north, from higher up the road, which made no sense because the high road north led to nothing but the Harker homestead and wilderness beyond. Unless someone had come around. Caleb was out of the stable before she'd stood up from the step, and he came to the porch in 3 long strides and put his hand on her arm, not grabbing, not restraining, just present. And they stood together and listened. One horse, one rider. Coming fast, then slowing as they approached. The rider who came around the tree line was a woman, not young, somewhere in her 50s, with the upright posture of someone who had spent decades on horseback and silver in her dark hair and eyes that took in the whole situation in a single sweep. She rode a gray horse that looked like it had covered serious ground today and was not tired. She looked at Caleb. "You're a hard man to find when you don't want to be found," she said. Caleb said Helen. The woman looked at Evelyn. "And you must be the reason he's gotten complicated." She swung down from the horse with a facility that said the horse's height was not a consideration. "My name is Helen Garvey. I am a federal marshal." Evelyn stared at her. She looked at Caleb. He was not surprised. He was not surprised because he had known this was coming, she realized. The letter to Denver, not to a former colleague, not exactly. Or not only. He had sent word to someone in the federal system, and this was the response faster than it should have been possible, which meant the network was already moving before his letter arrived, which meant, "You knew she was coming," Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. "I knew someone was coming," he said. "I didn't know it would be Helen." "You sent a letter to Denver this morning," Evelyn said. "She rode from—" She looked at Helen. "Where did you ride from?" "Dunbar," Helen said. "I've been in Dunbar for 4 days. We had a report from a Chicago federal contact 3 weeks ago about a possible procurement fraud connected to an industrial operator named Caldwell." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "We've been trying to locate the evidence. A ledger specifically kept by a mill clerk who left Chicago 6 days before we were notified." She paused. "That clerk's name is Evelyn Harper." The mountain was very quiet. "You've been looking for me," Evelyn said. "The federal side has been looking for me." "We've been looking for the ledger," Helen said. "You happened to come with it." "And Huxley's men," Evelyn said. "Driscoll, the man on the road, the man on the slope. Are 4 in total on this mountain," Helen said. "We've been tracking them since Harrow Creek." She looked at Caleb. "You sent them north to Harker's. Smart. Bought us time." "Bought us time for what?" Evelyn said. Helen reached into her coat and brought out a folded document. She held it out to Evelyn. It was a federal writ, signed by a judge in Denver. It named Hiram Caldwell, named the procurement officer, whose name Evelyn had given Caleb in the dark cabin last night, named 3 associated accounts she recognized from the ledger because she had written them herself. "This was issued 2 days ago," Helen said. "Before your letter arrived, Caleb, based on the preliminary report from our Chicago contact." She looked at Evelyn. "But the writ requires the original documentary evidence to proceed. It requires the ledger. And it requires the testimony of the person who kept the records who can explain what the entries mean." "Me?" Evelyn said. "You," Helen said. Evelyn looked at the writ. She looked at Caleb. She looked at Helen Garvey, who had ridden hard from Dunbar and come up the north road to stand on a cabin porch and hand her a federal document with a steadiness that suggested she'd done things like this before and would do them again. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked. "Now." Helen said, "You're not just a witness for circuit court. You're a federal witness, which means you have federal protection." She put the writ back in her coat. "And it means Caldwell's men on this mountain just became a much more serious problem for them than they currently understand." Caleb said, "How long before they know?" "They'll know when we tell them," Helen said, "which I'd like to do tonight while we know where they are." She looked at Evelyn. "Unless you need time." Evelyn thought about 6 months of running. She thought about the train, the platform, the bruises, the alley in Chicago, the 432 names. She thought about what it felt like to be the only person carrying something that should have had many hands under it. "I don't need time," she said. Helen nodded. She looked at Caleb. "I'll need you on the slope approach. You know the terrain." "I know it," he said. "Good." She started back to her horse. "We move in an hour." Caleb turned to Evelyn. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd spent 4 days learning, the one that had the most going on behind it. "Are you sure?" he said. "I've been sure since Chicago," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to be sure with." He was quiet for a moment. "You do now," he said. She held his gaze. Something in her chest tightened and then released the way a knot releases when you finally apply enough pressure in exactly the right direction. "I know," she said. "I know I do." Above them, the summer sky was moving toward evening, and the mountain held them in its enormous quiet, and somewhere on the slope below, 4 men were sitting in the dark, not knowing that everything was about to change. And in the cabin behind her, in the lining of a suitcase, a ledger waited. It had traveled 4 days on a train and up a mountain road, and through 3 weeks of fear and calculation, and 2 men at midnight, and a woman on a gray horse from Dunbar. And it had not been found, and it had not been taken, and it was still exactly what it had always been. Proof. And proof Evelyn Harper had decided a long time ago was the only thing in the world that didn't need protecting. It just needed delivering. The hour passed faster than Evelyn expected, which was how she knew she was afraid. Time always compressed when she was afraid. It had done it in Chicago the morning she'd taken the ledger. She'd given herself an hour and come out of the office with the ledger in her coat and looked at her watch and found that 20 minutes had passed, and the shock of it had nearly undone her on the street. Fear ate time. It was one of the things nobody told you. She used the hour to prepare. She changed into the darker of her 2 remaining dresses. Not vanity, practicality. She did not want to be a visible thing on a dark slope. She tied her hair back tightly. She checked the ledger one more time, pressing her hand flat against the cover, the way she'd been doing for weeks now, a physical confirmation that it still existed, that it was still real, that she had not imagined all of this. Then she put it back in the lining of the suitcase, and she buckled the suitcase, and she set it against the wall of the back room, where it would be exactly where she left it when she returned. She was going to return. She had decided that also. Helen was outside with the horses when Evelyn came out, checking her saddle with the efficient attention of someone who trusted equipment and verified it anyway. She had a rifle in the scabbard and a pistol at her hip, and she wore both with the ease of a woman who had stopped thinking about them as objects a long time ago and had started thinking of them as simply part of how she moved through the world. Evelyn watched her and thought about what it would take to become that, to wear that ease, to stand on a mountain slope in the evening with armed men below and look like the most settled person in the situation. She thought it probably took a very long time and a very high cost, and that Helen Garvey had paid both. Caleb came around from the stable with his horse and a rifle she hadn't seen before, longer than a standard saddle gun, the kind of weapon that said something specific about range and intent. He checked it with 3 precise movements and slid it into the scabbard without looking at Evelyn, and then he looked at Evelyn. "You stay behind us," he said. "Not far behind, close enough to hear me, but behind." "Understood," she said. "If anything goes sideways," he started. "I go back to the cabin," she said. "I lock the door. I don't open it unless I hear your voice." He nodded. "And the ledger," she said. "Stays with you," he said. "Always stays with you." Helen mounted. Caleb mounted. Evelyn mounted the brown mare, who accepted her weight with the same patient indifference as always, and she thought very briefly, and with a specific kind of tenderness, that she had grown genuinely fond of this horse. They rode down the slope in single file, Helen leading Caleb behind her, Evelyn behind Caleb, the horses picking their way in the last of the evening light through the pines, quiet as the mountain itself. Helen put up her hand. They stopped. She pointed 2 o'clock below a rocky outcrop. A small fire, barely more than coals, just enough to see by without being a beacon. 2 figures seated, one standing off to the side watching the trail. 3 men visible, the 4th somewhere she couldn't identify. Helen turned and looked at Caleb. Something passed between them, experienced people communicating in the compressed language of people who have done difficult things together before, or at least done difficult things in enough parallel that the grammar was the same. He nodded once. Helen rode forward, not fast, deliberately, the kind of approach that says, "I know you're there, and I'm not afraid of it," which was, Evelyn had come to understand, an entirely different statement than, "I don't know, you're there, and infinitely more powerful." "Federal Marshal," Helen said loud and even. "Everybody keep their hands where I can see them." What happened next unfolded in segments, the way violent things unfolded, not as a continuous flow, but as a series of hard, separate moments with gaps between them, where time did the thing it did. The 2 seated figures came to their feet. The standing figure turned. All 3 of them went still with the specific stillness of men calculating, and Evelyn recognized the calculation, because she had watched men do it in the mill yard, that rapid internal mathematics of what are my options and what do they cost. Driscoll's voice from one of the seated positions. "You don't have jurisdiction up here. Federal writ says otherwise," Helen said. She reached into her coat. "I'll read it if you'd like." "Where's the 4th man?" Caleb said from beside Helen, and the question landed differently than anything Helen had said it landed, because it showed them that they knew that the invisible fourth man was not the advantage they'd been counting on. A silence. Then from behind Evelyn, from behind her, from the trees at her back, the fourth man's voice. "Right here," he said. The mare shied hard. Evelyn grabbed the reins and held her both hands. Knuckles' white thighs clamped the horse spinning under her, and she held her. She held her. She had been riding exactly 4 days in her life, and she held a spooked horse on a dark slope through nothing but the absolute refusal to fall. The mare steadied. Evelyn looked at the man who had come out of the trees behind her. He was not Driscoll. He was not the smooth voice. He was not the third man she'd seen on the trail that morning. He was someone new, which meant Caldwell had sent more than the 4 she'd counted, which meant the number had never been 4, and the cold clarity of that landed through her body from the top of her spine to the soles of her feet. "Get down from the horse," the man said. He was looking at her with the specific focus of a man who has been given one instruction and intends to follow it. "You in the bag." "I don't have a bag," she said. "The suitcase," he said. "From the cabin. You went in and came out, and you were carrying nothing, but you came out different than you went in." He took a step toward her. "Give me the suitcase." "I left it in the cabin," she said. "Then we'll go get it," he said. Caleb's voice from 20 feet ahead. "Evelyn." She didn't take her eyes off the man in front of her. "I'm all right," she said. She was not all right. She was sitting on a horse in the dark, with a strange man 2 steps away, telling her to go back to the cabin, and everything she had carried from Chicago was in that cabin, and she had approximately 3 seconds before this situation became something she could not talk her way out of. She thought about the broad delivery cart in Chicago. She thought about how she had survived that by moving before the men expected it. She turned the mare hard left and kicked her, and the mare went. The man grabbed for the bridle, got air. Evelyn rode past him and kept going, not up toward the cabin, not down toward the confrontation, but sideways along the slope through the trees in the direction that put the most distance between herself and the man, the fastest, and the mare ran because horses run when they're pointed at open space, and asked firmly, and Evelyn was asking as firmly as she knew how. She heard shouting behind her. She heard Caleb's voice. She couldn't make out words. Just the tone, which was not panicked, which meant he was handling something, which meant she needed to handle her own thing and let him handle his. She rode for 2 minutes, which felt like 20, before she pulled the mare up behind a boulder that gave her cover and a sightline back down the slope. She could see the fire. She could see figures moving. She could hear voices, but not words. She sat and watched and breathed and told herself, "This is what you do. You wait. You watch. You figure out what's true before you move." A shot. 1. Sharp. From a pistol, not a rifle. She was moving before she decided to move. Maud. She came back down the slope at a controlled canter because a full run in the dark through pines was how you killed a horse and possibly yourself, and the mare handled it with a steadiness that she was going to be grateful for later when she had time to be grateful. She came out of the trees into the firelight and stopped. Helen stood with her pistol out, pointed at Driscoll, who was on his knees with his hands up and an expression that had moved entirely past calculation into something simpler. The smooth voice, she could see him now. An older man in a good coat that had no business being on a mountain. Someone who was used to managing situations from offices was against a pine tree with his wrists in iron, placed there by what appeared to be the work of approximately 1 minute. The third man was on the ground. Not shot, she could see him breathing. He was moving. He appeared to have had a very rapid and one-sided conversation with Caleb's elbow, or possibly his rifle stock. Caleb stood in the middle of all of it looking at the tree line, looking for her. He saw her come out of the trees and something in him. Something she could see even at this distance, even in firelight, released. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic person. But it released, and she saw it, and she understood it. "Where's the fourth man?" she said, pulling the mare up. "Ran," Helen said without taking her eyes off Driscoll. Went north up the trail. We'll find him. Or he'll keep running, Caleb said, coming to her horse. He looked up at her. He looked at her with the same specific quality of attention he'd had since the platform, and she was tired, and her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline leaving, and she thought very plainly, this man is going to be someone important to me, and I already know it, and I have known it for some time. You held the horse, he said. 4 days of riding, she said. She's a good horse. You're a better rider than you think, he said. She got down. Her legs were not perfectly steady, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. Caleb was close enough that when she came off the horse, she almost reached for his arm for balance and caught herself, and he noticed her catch herself and said nothing about it, which she appreciated. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. Are you? No, he said. Helen had Driscoll on his feet now, and was speaking to him in a tone that was brisk and not unkind, and entirely without negotiation, explaining what was going to happen next, in the particular way of a person who has explained consequences to people many times, and knows the most efficient path through it. Driscoll listened. He looked like a man who had worked out that his mathematics had failed him, and was in the process of recalculating from new premises. The smooth voice, the man against the pine tree, was not listening to Helen. He was looking at Evelyn. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from Chicago, from the face of the man in the alley who had told her in a reasonable voice that she should reconsider the direction her life was taking. Not anger, not fear. Calculation still even now, even in irons, even with a federal marshal 6 feet away. She walked toward him. Caleb moved to follow, and she put her hand up briefly, and he stopped. She stood in front of the man against the pine tree. She looked at him directly. You work for Huxley, she said. I work for a number of people, he said. You came all the way to Colorado, she said. For a ledger. For property that belongs to my employer, he said. $60,000, she said. That's what that ledger documents. $60,000 taken from 432 workers over 3 years. She looked at him steadily. Do you know their names? The workers? He said nothing. I do, she said. I wrote the payroll records for 2 years. I know every name. She held his gaze. The ledger is already spoken for. It's going to Dunbar. Whatever Huxley promised you, whatever Caldwell is paying it, is not going to change what that ledger is going to do. She paused. And the federal writ is already signed, which means even if something happened to me, which it won't, the process has already started. You rode all the way up here for something that's already too late to stop. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very sure of yourself, he said. For a ledger clerk. I know what the numbers say, she said. I always have. She turned and walked back to where Caleb was standing, and she heard the man behind her make a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else, and she did not look back. Caleb looked at her when she reached him. His expression was the complicated one, the one with more behind it than on it. Feel better, he said quietly. Much, she said. They brought the 3 men down the mountain in the dark. Helen on point, Caleb covering the rear. Evelyn riding in the middle, with the 3 captives walking ahead of her horses. It was a long 2 hours, and nobody spoke much. The mountain was dark, and the stars were immense, and the brown mare walked with steady patience through all of it. They reached Harrow Creek at midnight. Haddon came to his door in a dressing gown when Helen knocked, took one look at the situation, and began making coffee without being asked. He sent his housekeeper's boy to wake the town constable, who arrived sleep-rumpled and wide-eyed, and was handed 3 prisoners and a federal writ in the space of 5 minutes. The 4th man is in the territory, Helen told the constable. He went north. I'll have riders out at first light. The constable looked at the smooth-voiced man in the good coat, and then at Helen's badge, and then at Caleb. And he said, Mr. Whitaker, I don't suppose you want to explain what's happened on your mountain. Miss Garvey can explain it better than I can, Caleb said. She has the paperwork. The constable looked like he felt that was probably true. Evelyn sat in Haddon's front room and drank the coffee that appeared in front of her, and held the cup with both hands because her hands were still not perfectly steady, and the warmth helped. Mrs. Dunmore arrived at some point word-traveled in Harrow Creek at the speed of lit windows and lamp movement, and sat beside Evelyn, without invitation and without comment, and pressed a piece of cold cornbread into her hand. "Eat that," Mrs. Dunmore said. Evelyn ate it. She was in fact very hungry. She had forgotten to be hungry for approximately 4 hours. "You're going to be all right," Mrs. Dunmore said, not kindly exactly. "Factually." "I know," Evelyn said. "You look like you know," Mrs. Dunmore said, with something that was probably as close to approval as that face got. "That's different from most people." Caleb came and sat beside her when the formal transactions were done, and he brought a second cup of coffee and set it in front of himself and looked at the table for a moment. "Helen wants to leave for Dunbar in 2 days," he said. "2 days," Evelyn said. "She wants to make sure the fourth man is found before we move," he said. "Once you're in transit with the ledger, she wants the mountain clear." "That's sensible," Evelyn said. "She'll ride with us," he said. "Me, her, and 2 more marshals coming from Dunbar to meet us at the Valley Road." He paused. "It'll be a full escort." Evelyn thought about that. A full escort. Federal marshals on the road to Dunbar, and Judge Ames, and a federal courtroom, and everything that came after the testimony, the evidence, the names in the ledger, the weight of $60,000, and a federal contracts officer, and a procurement fraud, and 432 workers who had never known someone was fighting for them. She thought about all of it, and she was not afraid. She was tired. She was profoundly bone-deep tired in a way she hadn't let herself feel since Chicago, because fear kept the tiredness at bay. But the fear was different now, not gone, not entirely, but different, changed in quality, and in that changed space, the tiredness had finally found room to come in. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said. "When the ledger is delivered and the testimony is given. What happens to the trading post?" He seemed slightly surprised by the question. "It keeps running," he said. "Same as always." "The records are a genuine disaster," she said. "You know that." "I know it," he said. "You told me." "I got the first year organized," she said, "in about 4 hours." "You did," he said. She looked at the coffee cup. "I was thinking," she said, "that 7 more years is a fair amount of work, the cataloging." She paused. "If the position were still open." The room was warm, and Haddon was speaking quietly to Helen in the corner, and Mrs. Dunmore was doing something purposeful near the kitchen doorway, and everything was ordinary, and Caleb Whitaker sat beside Evelyn Harper at a table in Harrow Creek and looked at her with an expression that she could now read entirely. "The position is open," he said. "The pay would need to be discussed," she said. "Reasonable," he said. "And I'd want to renegotiate the system," she said. "The one you have now is not a system." "We've established that," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Between them was the specific warmth of 2 people who have been through something together that has told them something true about each other. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Outside, Harrow Creek was quiet in the mountain dark, and the stars were the same extravagant stars she'd seen on the ridge the first day, and somewhere in the east, Chicago was already starting its morning. The mill whistles going, the workers lining up at the gates, the paymaster shuffling records in a system that was, though none of them knew it yet, about to be called to account. And in the front room of Arthur Haddon's house, with cold cornbread and 2 cups of coffee and a retired federal marshal, and a federal marshal currently active, and a lawyer in a dressing gown, Evelyn Harper made a decision. She was staying. Not because the ledger had brought her here. Not because Garrett Hollis was dead, and she had nowhere else to go. Not because the mountain was beautiful, or because the trading post needed a proper cataloging system, or because Bern Aldis could move a letter through the mountains on a handshake. She was staying because she had spent 6 months being a woman with no one standing beside her, and she had survived it. She had more than survived it. She had carried 432 people's justice on a 4-day train through pure force of will, and nobody's help, and she was proud of that. She was going to be proud of that for the rest of her life. But she did not have to do the next thing alone. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her with the expression she'd been learning to read all week, and she'd gotten good enough at it now to know what this particular version of it meant. He'd been watching her make a decision. He'd been watching her arrive somewhere. And he was not going to say a word about it until she did, because that was who he was. The man who waited in the specific way that left the room for the person who needed room. "The fourth man," she said. "The one who ran north." "Helen will find him," Caleb said. "I know," she said, "but until she does tonight, I'd rather not be alone in the cabin." He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Dunmore has a room," he said. "Mrs. Dunmore has a room," she agreed. "I'll sleep at the post," he said. "Close enough." She nodded. "Close enough," she said. She finished the coffee. Then something happened that she had not planned and did not control. She laughed. Quietly and briefly and a little unevenly, the way laughter comes sometimes after fear has finally finished its transit through your body, and Caleb looked at her with one eyebrow fractionally raised. "What?" he said. "I came to Colorado to marry a man I'd never met," she said. "And instead, I'm going to testify before a federal judge and then catalog 7 years of Trading Post records." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that funny?" he said. "It's something," she said. He looked at her with the near territory of a smile. "Yes," he said. "It is." Mrs. Dunmore appeared in the doorway. "Miss Harper," she said, "your room is ready." Evelyn stood. Caleb stood. She looked at him once more in the lamplight of Haddon's front room, and she thought about the platform at Harrow Creek, and the train in Chicago, and the alley, and the 4 days between then and now, and everything those 4 days had contained, and she thought that if you had asked her standing on that platform, with her carefully rehearsed face falling apart, whether she could have predicted any of this, she would have said no. She would have been wrong, not about the details, about the possibility. She had always believed somewhere below the level she examined that there was a version of things in which she was not alone. She just hadn't known yet where it lived. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Good night, Miss Harper," he said, and then quietly with the same weight he'd put in, "You're welcome on the mountain," he added. "Clara." She stopped. She turned back. He was already looking at the table. She let him have that. She went to the door that Mrs. Dunmore was holding open, and she walked through it, and she did not look back, but she was smiling, and she let herself smile, and it was the first time in 6 months that she had smiled without remembering immediately why she shouldn't. Behind her in Haddon's front room, she heard Helen Garvey say something quiet to Caleb. She heard his low response. She heard Helen laugh a short, surprised sound, as if something he'd said had caught her off guard, and then silence. Evelyn went up the stairs to the room Mrs. Dunmore had made ready. She set her suitcase on the floor. She did not open it. She lay on the bed in her clothes and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of Harrow Creek settling into its late-night quiet. And she thought about tomorrow, and the day after, and the road to Dunbar, and what waited at the end of it. She did not think about what came after that. Not yet. One thing at a time. That was still how you survived. She closed her eyes, and then she heard it boots on the stairs. Not Caleb's. Different gate lighter faster. Helen's voice through the door. "Miss Harper." Evelyn sat up. "We have a problem," Helen said. The door opened. Helen stood in the frame with her lamp and her expression rearranged from the settled confidence of an hour ago into something that was not quite fear. Helen Garvey probably did not do fear in any visible way, but was its functional equivalent. "The fourth man," Helen said. "He didn't go north." Evelyn was on her feet. "He circled back," Helen said. "Aldous found him 20 minutes ago coming down from the cabin's direction." She paused. "He had a suitcase, Miss Harper." The room tilted. Not the suitcase in this room. The suitcase she'd left in the back room of the cabin. Against the wall. Exactly where she'd left it. "He has the ledger," Evelyn said. Helen looked at her steadily. "He has a suitcase," she said. "We don't know yet what's in it." "I know what's in it," Evelyn said. She was already moving to the door. Caleb was already at the bottom of the stairs. She didn't know how he'd gotten there before her. She'd moved the moment Helen finished her sentence. But he was there, hat on, rifle in hand, with the particular quality of stillness that meant he had already processed the situation and was waiting for her to catch up to where he was. "You heard?" she said. "I heard," he said. "He has the ledger." "He has a suitcase," Caleb said, exactly as Helen had said it. "Where did you leave it?" "Back room, against the wall. I buckled it." She was moving toward the door, and he moved with her. "I had the ledger in the lining, the interior lining sewn in. He'd have to know it was there to find it fast. If he just grabbed the suitcase and ran—" "Then the ledger is still in the lining," Caleb said. "Unless he opened it on the way down," she said. "In the dark, on a mountain trail, running." She stopped. She thought about that. A man running down a mountain trail in the dark with a stolen suitcase did not stop to examine the contents. A man running did one thing: he ran. "Aldous has him," she said. "Aldous and the constable," Helen said, coming down behind them. "They stopped him on the south road out of town. He's at the constable's office." "The suitcase. With him," Helen said. "Constable didn't open it. He's waiting." Evelyn was out the door before Helen finished the sentence. The constable's office was 4 buildings down and across the street, and the night air hit her face cold and clear as she crossed, and she was aware of Caleb 1 step behind her and Helen 1 step behind him, and she was aware that she was walking fast, in a way that was almost running, and she did not slow down. The constable opened the door before she reached it. He'd seen them coming through the window. The 4th man was seated in the chair against the far wall, wrists bound with the specific expression of a man who has been caught and is now doing the arithmetic of consequences. He was younger than Driscoll, younger than the smooth voice in the good coat, mid-20s maybe, with a rawness to his face that said he was newer to this work than the others. The suitcase was on the constable's desk. Evelyn went to it. She looked at it. The buckle was still fastened exactly as she'd left it. She opened it. Her clothes were there, slightly disordered. He'd moved things, looked through, found nothing obvious. She pressed her hand to the bottom, pressed the lining. The ledger was still there. She closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 full second of something that was not quite prayer and not quite gratitude, but contained both. Then she opened them, took the ledger out of the lining and held it up. She looked at the 4th man. "Looking for this," she said. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He looked at the floor. "What's your name?" she said. He didn't answer. "How old are you?" she said. He looked up. 22, he said, and immediately looked like he hadn't meant to answer. 22, she said. She looked at him for a moment. He had the face of someone who had made a decision for money that had landed him somewhere he hadn't fully imagined. She had seen that face in the mill. Young men who had taken shifts that paid extra without asking why, who had carried packages without asking what was in them, who had done the small practical things that large corrupt systems required someone to do and had told themselves it was just work. "Who hired you?" she said. "Driscoll," he said. "And who hired Driscoll?" He pressed his mouth together. "It doesn't matter," Helen said from the doorway. "We know who hired Driscoll." She looked at the constable. "He stays here tonight. We'll sort the charges in the morning." The constable nodded with the air of a man who was very happy to let someone else sort things. Evelyn put the ledger under her arm. She picked up the suitcase. She looked at the 22-year-old one more time, and something in her not softness, exactly more like accuracy, made her say, "Whatever Huxley paid you, it wasn't enough for a federal charge. When someone offers you that again, remember tonight." He looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, quietly, like a boy, not a man. She walked out. Outside on the boardwalk, with the ledger in her hands, and the cold night air and the stars overhead, she stopped walking and stood still for a moment, and let everything that had happened in the last 4 hours move through her, the way water moves through, not stopped, just passed. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He stood beside her in the dark and waited because he was Caleb Whitaker, and waiting was something he did better than anyone she'd met, and she was grateful for it, in a way that had gotten past gratitude into something she didn't have a clean word for. "It's still here," she said, looking at the ledger. "It's still here," he agreed. "I keep checking," she said. "I've been checking since Chicago, every few hours, just pressing my hand on it to make sure it's real." "That's not unusual," he said. "It feels unusual," she said. "When you've been carrying something alone for a long time," he said, "it stops feeling like a thing you're holding and starts feeling like a thing that's holding you. You check because you're not sure anymore which one of you is keeping the other alive." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the street, not at her. His hat was pulled down slightly, and his shoulders were the same as always, that solid, unannounced breadth that had nothing to prove, and he said things like that with the same voice. He said everything quiet and without performance, as if profundity were just another accurate statement that happened to land deeper than others. "You've carried something like that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The last case," he said. "Before I came up here, I told you about it." "You did everything right," she said, "and people still got hurt." "I carried it for 2 years," he said. "Checked it every few hours just like you said, making sure it was still real, making sure I hadn't imagined how badly it had gone. And then," he looked at her. "And then I came up a mountain," he said, "and I ran a trading post, and eventually the checking got further apart, and eventually I could go a whole day without pressing my hand on it." She held the ledger tighter. "How long is eventually?" she said. "Different for everyone," he said. "But it comes." Helen's voice behind them. "We should get off the street." They went back to Haddon's. Helen and Haddon were at the table with papers and a lamp, and the serious, focused energy of two people who were building something procedural and intended to build it correctly. And Evelyn sat at the end of the table and put the ledger in front of her and looked at it. "We leave for Dunbar in 2 days," Helen said without looking up. "I'm not changing that. The 4 men are contained, and riders go out at first light for any others Caldwell sent." She paused. "But I want to talk through the testimony. Tonight, if you can manage it." "I can manage it," Evelyn said. Helen looked up then. She looked at Evelyn with the specific appraisal she'd been applying since she rode in on the gray horse, not unkind, but rigorous, the look of a woman who needed to know exactly what she was working with. "When you testify before Ames," Helen said, "you'll need to walk through the records entry by entry for the sections that document the procurement payments. Not all of it he'll have the ledger as physical evidence, but he needs to hear from you what each column means and why it means that. Because the defense, and there will be a defense, Caldwell will have lawyers in Dunbar within the week, will argue that the records are ambiguous. That a ledger clerk making entries doesn't necessarily understand the context of what she's recording." "I understand what I recorded," Evelyn said. "I know you do," Helen said. "Tell me." So Evelyn opened the ledger and she told her. She went through it the way she'd gone through it alone in her head on the train in the dark of the cabin every time she'd needed to remind herself that she wasn't wrong, that she hadn't misread it, that what she'd found was what she'd found. She went through each section, the wage differential columns, the secondary accounts, the payment records, the dates that matched the suppressed complaints, the federal contracts officer's name in the disbursement column, with a figure beside it that was too large to be anything but what it was. Helen listened without interrupting. Haddon took notes. Caleb sat at the far end of the table and listened with his hands around a coffee cup and his eyes on her face. When she finished, the lamp had burned lower, and the night was deep and genuine quiet had settled over Harrow Creek. Helen sat back. "You know this ledger," she said. "Every entry," Evelyn said. "When Caldwell's lawyers tell Judge Ames that a 23-year-old clerk couldn't possibly understand the implications of what she was recording." "I was 23 when I started the job," Evelyn said. "I'm 24 now, and I understood the implications from the 4th month. I just didn't have anywhere to take them." She looked at Helen steadily. "That's not ignorance. That's isolation. There's a difference. Helen held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, she said. There is. She gathered her papers. Get some sleep, both of you. She looked at Caleb. You too. Caleb stood without protest, which told Evelyn he was more tired than he'd shown, and she was glad Helen had said it because she doubted he would have gone on his own. She went upstairs to the room Mrs. Dunmore had made ready, and she put the ledger on the table beside the bed where she could touch it in the dark if she needed to. And she lay down, and she looked at the ceiling, and she did something she had not done since the night she'd made the decision to take the ledger in the first place. She let herself think about what came after. Not the testimony, not the road to Dunbar, not the next 2 days, the after. What Evelyn Harper's life looked like on the other side of this. She'd been too afraid to think about it directly for 6 months because thinking about the after meant believing there was one, and belief during a long run is an expensive thing to carry alongside everything else. But she believed it now. She believed it because the ledger was on the table beside her, and 4 men were in a constable's office, and a federal writ had been signed in Denver, and a circuit judge was in Dunbar, and a woman named Helen Garvey rode hard from anywhere she was needed, and a man named Caleb Whitaker had said "we" on the second day and meant it every day since. She slept without checking the ledger. That was new. The 2 days passed in the particular way that days pass when you have too much to do and not enough hours, fast in the doing and slow in the waiting, which was its own kind of difficult. Helen's riders went out and came back. No additional Caldwell men were found on the mountain, which either meant there were no more or meant they'd gotten word of the night's events and made their own decision about discretion. Evelyn chose to believe the former because it was more useful. She spent the first day at Haddon's table going through the testimony structure with Helen until she could walk through it forward and backward and could answer any question Helen constructed to break it. Helen constructed good questions. Evelyn answered every one. She spent the second morning at the trading post with Caleb finishing the organization of the second year of records because she had said she would, and because there was a particular comfort in the specific and manageable task of columns that either balanced or didn't. They worked in the same companionable quiet they'd found on the first morning, and at midday he made coffee and they sat across from each other at the rough table, and she looked at the stacked and organized ledgers. Her work, her system clean and functional and true, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as belonging. Not to the place exactly, or not only to the place. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked at her over his cup. "When this is done," she said, "when the testimony is given and the case is with the federal court and the ledger has been what it was supposed to be, what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking which was different. "I want to stop running a trading post with no functional record system," he said. She smiled. She hadn't expected the deflection, and it caught her. "Be serious," she said. "That was serious," he said. He set his cup down. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the slope in the dark when she'd come back on the mare with relief that had passed, relief and become something else. "I want what I've got," he said. "Plus some." "Plus some," she said. "The post," he said. "The mountain, Harrow Creek." He paused. "The person who knows how to organize 8 years of records in an afternoon." She looked at him. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn," he said. "I need you to say it plainly," she said. "I've spent 6 months reading between lines, and I am tired of it. Say what you mean." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the same quality he brought to everything, direct, unperformed, accurate, "Stay," he said. "Not for the job. Not for the ledger or the post or the mountain. Stay because I don't want you to leave. And I think you don't want to leave either, but you're waiting to see if I'm going to say it, so I'm saying it." The room was very quiet. She thought about the train platform. She thought about the rehearsed face that had fallen apart. She thought about $14.30 and a dead man's address and no plan, and the man who had picked up her suitcase before she'd finished asking and walked her to the boarding house, and spoken to a lawyer that same morning. "I don't want to leave," she said. "Then don't," he said. "It's not simple," she said. "After the testimony, Caldwell will have lawyers everywhere. If the case goes federal, it could take months. I may need to be available." Helen said. "I know what Helen said," he said. "Available doesn't mean Chicago. You can be available from here." "And the position," she said. "Still open," he said. "The pay," she said. "Negotiable," he said. "And the system," she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned completely now, the one she could read all the way through. "The system," he said, "is whatever you build it to be." She sat with that for a moment. Then she put out her hand across the table, the way she'd have done in the mill office, when a deal was reached, direct, businesslike, leaving no room for ambiguity. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He reached out and took her hand, and they shook, and neither of them let go immediately after, which was also something she had decided to stop pretending she hadn't wanted. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. His hand was warm and large and certain the way everything about him was certain, and she held it for one extra moment and then released it, because there was still a road to Dunbar, and a judge to meet, and a ledger to deliver, and she had not come all this way to lose her composure at the finish line. "We should get back," she said. "Helen wants to ride at first light tomorrow." "She does," he said. They closed the trading post together and rode back down to Harrow Creek in the afternoon sun, and she was aware of the mountain around her in the specific way she'd become aware of it since the ridge. Not as scenery, but as presence, as something that had its own weight and character, that demanded a certain quality of attention and gave something back in return. She understood now why a man who had been through what Caleb had been through had chosen to come here. You couldn't be careless in a place like this. You had to be exactly what you were, because the mountain didn't accommodate anything else. She thought she could be exactly what she was here. She thought she'd been working toward it her whole life. They rode out the next morning at first light. Helen led with 2 additional marshals from Dunbar, who had arrived the previous evening. Solid, quiet men who looked at the terrain and the situation with the same professional calm Helen brought to everything. Caleb rode beside Evelyn and Byrne. Aldous rode with them for the first hour before splitting off at the Valley Road, touching his hat to Evelyn as he went. "Safe travels, Miss Harper," he said. "Clara," she said. He smiled. "Clara." He agreed and rode south. She kept the ledger inside her coat for the journey, not in the suitcase, not in the saddlebag against her body, where she could feel it with every movement, where no one could take it without her knowing. She'd made that decision before she mounted, and she'd told Caleb, and he'd nodded without comment, because that was the right decision, and he recognized it. The road to Dunbar was a day and a half of riding, and they covered the first day while stopping once at a way station that Helen had clearly used before, where the man at the door had coffee ready and didn't ask questions. They slept in shifts, 2 marshals keeping watch, and Evelyn slept 3 hours, and woke in the early dark, and lay still, and listened to the mountain quiet, and thought about 432 people who were going to work right now at this hour in Chicago, who didn't know that somewhere in the Colorado Territory, a woman was riding toward the person who could begin to make it right. On the second morning coming down out of the foothills toward the valley, one of the marshals rode up fast from the rear. "Riders behind us," he said to Helen. 3, moving to intercept." Helen didn't change her expression. She looked at Caleb. "Caldwell's people," Evelyn said. "Or his lawyers," Helen said. "Which can be the same thing." She looked at the marshal. "How far back?" 10 minutes, maybe less." "Then we ride," Helen said. They rode. It was not the controlled canter of the mountain slope, it was a genuine push. The horses stretched and working the road opening up ahead of them as the foothills gave way to the valley floor, and Evelyn rode with her hand pressed flat against her coat where the ledger was not, because it would help to hold it, but because she needed to feel. It needed to know it was still there while everything moved fast and loud around her. Caleb was beside her. He hadn't dropped back to the rear with the marshals. He stayed beside her, exactly beside her. And she didn't have to look at him to know he was there, because she could feel the presence of him the way you feel something solid when you're close to falling. The riders behind closed ground for 20 minutes and then didn't. Either their horses were spent, or they'd made a calculation about the futility of catching a federal marshal escort and decided to stand down. Helen slowed. Evelyn slowed. She pressed her hand against the ledger one more time. Still there. Don't stop, Caleb said beside her. We're close. I'm not stopping, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. I know, he said. Dunbar was a real town larger than Harrow Creek by a significant margin, with a courthouse at its center that was built from stone rather than timber, the kind of building that said permanence in a territory full of structures that said temporary. Judge Ames held his federal sessions in the back courtroom, and his clerk met them at the courthouse door with the specific efficiency of a man who had been told to expect them and intended to make good on it. Helen spoke to the clerk. The clerk led them inside. Evelyn had thought about this moment for 6 months. She had constructed it many times in her mind, the room, the judge, the moment of handing over the ledger, and what that handoff would feel like. She had imagined relief. She had imagined a kind of collapse, the physical deflation of setting something very heavy down. What she actually felt walking into the courthouse at Dunbar with the ledger inside her coat, and Caleb Whitaker one step behind her, was clear. Not relief. Not collapse. Clarity. The kind that comes when everything you've been moving toward resolves into a single point of action, and that action is finally simply here. Judge Ames was a compact man in his 60s with gray hair and reading spectacles on a chain, and the face of someone who had been measuring honesty against dishonesty for so long that the instrument was now extremely precise. He looked at Helen. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the ledger when she set it on the table in front of him. He did not touch it immediately. Miss Harper, he said. Judge Ames, she said. You kept these records, he said. Yes, sir, she said. For 2 years, and I can explain every entry. He looked at her over his spectacles. I have no doubt of that, he said. I've had a preliminary report from Marshal Garvey and a communication from the Federal Land Office in Denver. I know what you're carrying, and I know what it cost to carry it this far. He paused. Are you ready to give your testimony? She thought about the train, the platform, the cabin, the slope in the dark, and the mare shying, and the fourth man in the constable's office. The night in Haddon's house, and the lamp burning low, and Helen's careful questions, and Caleb's hand across the table. Yes, she said. I've been ready since Chicago. Ames nodded. He reached for the ledger. She let it go. After 6 months of pressing her hand against its cover in the dark, she opened her fingers and let it go, and it crossed the table to another pair of hands, and she watched it go and felt the weight shift, not disappear, but move, distribute, become something shared rather than something singular. The way weight becomes bearable when it's held by more than one person. She sat down. Caleb sat beside her. Helen took the chair to her left, and Evelyn Harper, who had come to Colorado on a 4-day train with $14.30 and a dead man's address and a stolen ledger and nowhere to go, began to speak. She testified for 3 hours. Ames asked questions with surgical precision, and she answered them with the same. The defense lawyers Caldwell had sent 2 of them arrived that morning from Denver, tried twice to interrupt, and Ames silenced them both times with a single look. Caleb sat beside her through all of it and said nothing, because there was nothing for him to say, and his silence was not absence, but presence, the kind that holds a room steady. When she finished, Ames set down his pen and looked at the ledger and then at Evelyn. Miss Harper, he said, in 22 years on the federal bench, I have had occasion to hear testimony from many witnesses about many things. I want you to understand something. He folded his hands on the table. The quality of evidence you've presented today, and the clarity with which you've presented it, is not common. It is not common in lawyers. It is not common in trained investigators. He paused. It is remarkable in a woman who did this alone under threat over 6 months without institutional support of any kind. She held his gaze and did not look away. I had support, she said. At the end. Ames looked at Caleb briefly. He allowed the smallest nod. "A federal warrant for Hiram Caldwell will be issued within the week," Ames said. "The procurement officer named in your testimony will be suspended pending investigation. The mills will be subject to a federal labor audit." He looked at the ledger. "And the 432 workers documented in these records will be notified of their right to seek restitution through the federal labor process." 432. She had said the number so many times in her head on the train in the cabin at Haddon's table that it had become almost abstracted a quantity rather than a collection of individual lives. But now in this room, with a federal judge saying the words restitution and process, and notified it, became people again. Women at their looms. Women counting their wages and finding them short. Women who had filed complaints and been told the complaints had gone nowhere, who had not known that somewhere a clerk had seen their names in a ledger and had not been able to unsee them. She pressed her lips together. She did not cry. She had promised herself she was done crying, and she kept her promises. But it was close. Caleb's hand was on the table between them, not touching hers close enough to touch if she needed it far enough to not presume. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she put hers on top of it. He turned his palm up, held her hand, said nothing. She said nothing. They sat like that while Ames signed documents, and his clerk moved papers, and Helen conferred with the defense lawyers in the corner in a tone that brooked exactly nothing. And the afternoon light came through the courthouse windows, and the stone walls held everything steady and certain. And Evelyn Harper sat in the silence after the hardest thing she'd ever done, and let herself be held by it. They stayed in Dunbar 2 nights at Helen's insistence, while the initial paperwork moved and the warrant process began, and the federal mechanism that Evelyn had set into motion started turning at its own enormous slow pace. On the second evening, she walked with Caleb through Dunbar's main street in the late summer light, and she told him about her father, about the household accounts at the kitchen table, and the man who had seen in his 8-year-old daughter something precise and useful, and had treated it as a gift rather than an oddity. She told him because she wanted him to know where she'd come from, and she told him because they were building something, and building required material. He told her about the case. The real version, not the outline, the names, what had happened, what he'd failed to prevent, and why, and what it had cost him to understand that right procedure and right outcome were not the same thing, and never had been. He told her in the plain, direct way he told everything, without self-pity, and without performance, and she listened with the same quality of attention he'd always given her. When he finished, she said, "You were right to come up the mountain. For a while," he said. "Long enough." She looked at him. "And now?" He looked back at her, and in the evening light of Dunbar's main street, he smiled. Not the near territory of a smile. The real thing. It changed his face completely, and she thought she would remember exactly what it looked like for the rest of her life. "And now," he said, "I've got a trading post that needs running, and 7 years of records that need doing, and a woman who knows how." "That's a very practical reason to come down the mountain," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. She stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at the ledger columns when she finally understood what they meant with the specific clarity of a thing seen completely without obstruction in full light. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm staying," she said. "Not for the job. Not for the post or the system or the practical reason." She held his gaze. "I'm staying because you stood on that platform and picked up my suitcase before I finished asking, and you went to a lawyer that same morning, and you said we on the second day, and you've meant it every day since." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hand up and touched her face, just his thumb along her cheekbone, brief and careful. The gesture of a man who is very sure about a small thing and wants to be honest about it. And then he lowered his hand. "Good," he said. She exhaled. "Good," she agreed. They rode back to Harrow Creek the next morning, just the two of them. Helen staying in Dunbar to manage the federal proceedings, And the mountain road was familiar now in a way that had nothing to do with the number of times she'd traveled it and everything to do with what she'd brought back from the other end. She did not check for the ledger. It was in Ames's courthouse in a federal evidence box doing exactly what it had always been meant to do. She rode lighter than she had since Chicago. The mare felt it. She moved differently without the weight of that specific anxiety, looser, more willing, as if the horse had been carrying it too. They came over the ridge, and the mountains opened up in every direction, and the summer sky was the color of something she didn't have a word for, and the pines smelled like everything that was real and certain in the world. And Evelyn Harper looked at it and let it be what it was. "Home," Caleb said beside her. She looked at him. She looked at the mountain. "Home," she said, and she meant it not as a question, not as a hope, not as a wish she was rehearsing her face to match. She meant it the way she meant the numbers in a ledger, completely, precisely, without qualification. She had come to Colorado with nothing and no one. She was going home with both,